Hello, everybody. Welcome to our follow-up session from Tuesday's presentation by Major Simone on the variety of issues for defense counsel, judges, and others dealing with individuals pretty much as a first responder in drug treatment courts who particularly are suffering from various aspects of post-traumatic stress disorder. I thank you for your attention, and if you missed or you want to review the webinar from Tuesday, that'll be on our website shortly. So there were a lot of issues discussed and a few exercises that were sent out that some of you have responded to. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Major Simone, and Kerwin Henderson, who is our point person here on our Veterans Treatment Court Initiative, will be fielding questions through the Q&A function that Monica referenced. And I just wanted to mention that this webinar series is being sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance Drug Court Technical Assistance Project at American University and our special Veterans Treatment Court Initiative. So, Major Simone, if you want to take over.
All right, thank you so much. I want to thank all of our attendees for coming back and participating in this. We talked earlier about the idea that there were some general considerations we should think about when it comes to veterans participating in veterans treatment courts, and the fact that there are some unique specific issues to address that may require a bit more than our universal precautions that we would adopt in other court settings, that there's something unique to veterans, and I want to explore that more at the practical level today. Again, I have to emphasize that I'm not here in any official capacity for any governmental or military organization. Our missions remain the same as they were during the last session, which is to identify specific concerns that are unique to veterans, to learn strategies that will help us better respond to those concerns, and to understand how all members of the treatment team, to include mentors, are oftentimes first responders to stress reactions that result from litigation-related triggers or other triggers, a combination of all types of triggers. And the notion here is not to provide any mental health treatment per se, but rather to deal with acute crises, to try to prevent acute stress situations and help the participants fully participate in the program. So there's a very clear limit on what we're trying to achieve. And certainly because of our own exposure as treatment team members to these underlying traumatic experiences, we need to understand the costs of caring and what that exposure can do to us, even though we didn't experience it firsthand. So we'll be going more in detail on practical considerations in each of these areas. Our agenda has changed. We have four specific things we'll be covering. First, we're going to talk about inventorying cumulative traumatic events during a person's lifetime, and that special piece of making sure to distinguish between military and combat traumatic events, and examining those with some level of granularity, where we can distinguish different types of military-related trauma that the participant has experienced. And what we're going to try to do is, the whole goal is the more we can become aware of, the more comprehensive the treatment plan can be, and it may also explain why there are additional considerations for effective recovery when there are other problem areas to address. The next thing we're going to do is talk about preventing the wild ride, that adrenaline rush that can derail and hijack the veterans' participation in the program. So the two components we'll be looking at are trigger awareness planning and then pre-docket relaxation exercises, which both contribute to effective participation in veterans treatment courts. As we proceed, we're going to talk about practical approaches for mitigating secondary traumatic stress, which really breaks out into two components. One is we need to check ourselves periodically, because a lot of the ways that we may be influenced won't be consciously available to us. We need to go and deliberately look to see how we're being influenced. And then next, when there is an exposure to something that's clearly traumatic, finding a way to, especially if you can do it in the workplace, address it rather than wait or not talk about it, and how to do that in the most constructive way. Those are two areas we'll talk about for a brief time. And then finally, I wanted to address the concerns that were raised during our last session regarding domestic and interpersonal violence in veterans treatment courts. And what I want to focus on is the importance of distinguishing between symptomatic battering and non-symptomatic battering. And it can also be described in other places as symptoms of PTSD and other operational stress injuries versus tactics that are used to perpetrate interpersonal and domestic violence. If we can distinguish between those two different areas, that will truly help to not only effectively assist the participant in the court and the family members and the victim, but in addition to that, it will also help avoid criticisms from the community because of this distinction. So I definitely want to touch on that before we conclude. When we're talking about veteran-specific traumatic experiences, the idea is to search for a range of military experiences. The more we can become aware of means that there's a better opportunity to enhance the recovery process. If we recall the comments of Judge Christine Carpenter, who is a Veterans Treatment Court judge, she commented that there are those secrets that are held back about past traumatic events. And when you think you're trying to address underlying trauma to help someone succeed, it keeps looking like they're failing unless you finally get to those past experiences that have been unaddressed and work that into the planning and the treatment. So the idea here is, through a very careful analysis of military traumatic experiences, it will lead to a better and more comprehensive treatment plan and approach. I want to talk a bit about cumulative trauma, and I think it's important for us to go back to that exercise involving Mary. It is true that there were some very similar ratings of experiences perceived by our viewers to reach a category of 10. But there were also different ratings, some as low as 3 for some of those events. So some were rated as a 10, some were rated as a 3. I think the most important thing we can gain from this exercise is that there is very much a tendency to try to adopt a linear approach and say, we're going to try to look at current symptoms and draw a line and connect that to what we perceive to be the most significant trauma. And I just want to share a few points from the research to help us gain a better and wider perspective on this. First, the key point here is that combined effects of trauma are different from any single traumatic event. They're different from the most recent traumatic event, and they're different from what we may perceive to be the most traumatic event. That when you have an additive effect, it's the accumulation of different traumatic events that also pose significant ties to symptoms. And the combination, what we can recognize is the combination of military sexual trauma and combat trauma pose very unique concerns in terms of treatment. This is an area where mental health professionals in the military are in agreement that there are significant challenges in treating that population. And it's even different from the combination of military sexual trauma and prior childhood sexual assault. What we can take back from that in our own practices is to recognize that when we identify a Veterans Treatment Court participant who has both combat trauma, and military sexual trauma, we should recognize that they are in a category where there are unique concerns and where treatment solutions may be more complicated. And just to be able to know that it may be a harder road ahead with that specific population, that's something to keep in mind. In addition, again, we talked about the linear model, and one of the problems with not appreciating the augmented effects of combined traumatic events is that oftentimes this can be concealed and there can be a risk of false attribution. And so when you target treatment strategies to specific types of trauma, you may miss others when we don't take this into account. So it's a complicated area. It's still developing. I will be providing you, if anyone wants it, I'll provide it free of charge, an article in which I joined up with a VA benefits attorney, and we looked at the problem of cumulative trauma in VA benefits. And one of the problems there is a lot of times, even though a survivor of military sexual trauma can prove that they were assaulted during military service, a response from the benefits adjudicators is oftentimes, well, hey, can you prove that your symptoms now can't be traced back to when you were abused as a child rather than in the military? So we're not going to grant service connection because it could be any one of these traumatic events in your past. This was very concerning to us, and we tried to explore best practices for how to address cumulative trauma with the goal of helping applicants for VA benefits better articulate their problems and their health conditions. But we have a section there that talks about this in that page range, and I'll be more than happy to provide it. Well, it's in this Columbia Journal of Gender and Law article. What I do want to suggest to you is that there are some approaches that have started to recognize this aggregate effect of cumulative trauma. And one of the interesting ones, I have the link there for you, is the Brief Betrayal Trauma Survey. I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but it does have a very keen sensitivity for how many times someone was exposed to particular types of events at different junctures in their life course. And what the suggestion is that there are certain categories of betrayal, from high betrayal, medium betrayal, and low betrayal. And this is the way that the person perceives the experience of that trauma and having been betrayed in suffering that trauma. And that when you can look at the types of events that fall into these categories, you have a better sense of the most prominent contributors to current symptoms. So it's really interesting, and I recommend that that's something worthy of exploring. Now, when we talk about traumatic life experiences and traumatic military experiences, the National Center for PTSD has developed a resource where they've collected various scales and assessment tools, all of which are there to assess much the same things, but there's different ways of doing it. The first section of the webpage addresses scales and tools that are endorsed by the National Center for PTSD. And then there's another section that describes other types of scales. But you have an opportunity to visit and explore these and try to get an idea of how to expand the types of events that you're gaining awareness of in your program. And I want to recommend this website to you. When we talk about explorations of military-related trauma, there are a number of unique scales. You've got the Aftermath of Battle scale, Combat Experiences scale. You even have a Combat Trauma Art Therapy scale that's been developed to address how veterans would relate images of their past trauma. So there's a variety of tools here. I just want to give you an example of the Operation Desert Storm Stress Exposure Scale. That scale was created because there was a recognition that a lot of tools developed to identify traumatic experiences in Vietnam veterans did not fully appreciate the experience of Gulf War veterans. So if you look at that scale, they have questions about trauma related to vaccinations, adverse reactions to medications, airborne exposures, exposures to radiation, exposure to sources of infection or contaminants, and then they break it out into psychological trauma. And with the oil fields burning and various environmental events that were unique to the Gulf War, they found it necessary to modernize the scales to account for the range of military operations. I would also suggest to you that if someone participated in a UN peacekeeping mission, there are unique factors related to that, especially with rules of engagement and not feeling like you can't fully defend yourself. That should also be considered. So some scales have as many as 31 different types of military unique trauma that they assess, and I've heard there's even more. One of the things that's still in development now is the moral injury event scale. And this is an attempt to try to capture morally injurious events that may not have been traumatic because of a life threat, but may have still become traumatic to an individual based on the perception of having to violate one's deeply held moral values while serving in the military. And it's broken out into a number of ways. Again, moral injury is something that is fairly new, and there is a lot of interest in refining these tools to make them more effective. But I want to emphasize to you, as you explore this scale and any of the others that we've talked about, our goal is not really to diagnose anything in a medical way, but I think it should be to better associate symptoms with possible contributors in the past. So if some of these things are not refined to the point of excellence or some kind of statistically significant standard, it still may be helpful based on the lived experience of veterans and the fact that this better addresses areas to further explore with mental health professionals who know what they're doing, who have the licenses to do it. So I would encourage examination of these different measures, certainly not to the point where it would be a 300-page assessment that would overwhelm a veteran. And certainly we need to remember that just going through these scales and answering these questions can be very aggravating to someone who suffers from symptoms. So there is a degree of sensitivity and minimization needed for this to not make it overwhelming. But when you can ask the right types of questions that will help probe experiences in that full manner, that gives you the most to work with. So there's a balance here. There is a war experiences inventory that I think is very comprehensive. It examines 29 military-related traumatic experiences, and the ones that I've highlighted in blue are, I think they represent a more thorough understanding of moral injury as well. So when they ask about lack of confidence in superiors during a deployment, when they ask about feelings that the veteran himself or herself or their peers or their leaders were not sufficiently prepared when going into combat, and that created a level of stress for them. These are developed and much more comprehensive kinds of approaches that could be helpful and could be a good guide of how to improve this inventory process. One thing I've provided, which will be provided to you, is the Deployment Risk and Resilience Inventory number 2. Number 1 was developed in 2003 with the goal of really being thorough and being deliberate about the different phases of deployment and stresses experienced and traumatic events experienced before, during, and after deployment to combat. It's a very long pamphlet. It's recognized as a suite that's available to you. 17 different scales. Each one has a different purpose. They can be removed and only one or two, administered rather than the whole thing. But I think that with the goal of being more comprehensive and recognizing the full range of experiences to include military sexual trauma, this is something that could be very helpful to you. And it's created by the Department of Veterans Affairs, also originated with the military. So this is something that could be a tool to you. And I think out of all the things I could give you, this one would be a good example. We also want to talk about stopping the wild ride. And that's, again, the notion that when someone is triggered and has a stress reaction, the adrenaline and the physiological process can actually result in an impairment in the ability to think, process information, because a person goes into a fight or flight mode, and if it's not dealt with, it could last up to 4 days. So the concern is, how do we prevent this from happening, especially when participating in a veterans treatment court docket and having some kind of treatment and going back to the appearance in the court? How do we manage all of this when there's such potential for triggering? So one of the things we want to do is examine the participants' litigation-related triggers and identify preventive measures based on the participants' lived experience. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail. The next thing we want to do is implement relaxation measures prior to the docket to increase participants' concentration and grounding in the present moment. And then next, whether it's PTSD, traumatic brain injury, or a combination of the two, these types of conditions oftentimes limit a person's ability to recall information, to organize facts, to be able to assess improvements, and have a level of insight just because of the effects of that condition. And one of the things that is tremendously helpful is to provide journals and the ability to write down just anything, right? Impressions, notes to oneself, to keep homework assignments organized, if we want to call them homework assignments. One of the goals is, if you have someone who succeeds in the course of a treatment plan and can capture in some notations to himself or herself the feeling of having made that achievement and been recognized for it, later on down the line when they may be experiencing more difficult times, to go back to their own reflections of how they felt when they succeeded can be a tremendous way to keep them invested and to help them endure. So some kind of way to capture progress, to recall what's going on during the course of appearances could be quite helpful, and certainly very low cost with potential for great benefits. So the Forensic Stress Trigger Awareness Plan, this is a bit simple, but the idea is to try to have the participant think about his or her own reactions to aspects of litigation that have caused stress reactions in the past, and to think about different factors that may have contributed to that, how they were able to calm down in the past, how they were able to get a handle, and to kind of rank the biggest concerns. And then to come up with plans on how to address that and how to limit the effects of such exposures in the future. So This could include everything from exposure to photographs, letters, contents of testimony, seeing spectators in the courtroom, certain aspects of interactions with judges or bailiffs or other court personnel. It's also important to try to get an idea of anniversaries of traumatic events, especially if it's something that is very clear, like the day of the IED attack in which the individual was injured, several friends might have been killed, subordinates, leaders, whatnot. That date is probably very well known to the veteran, and it's important to know if the veteran knows, because there could be traumatic reactions and responses just when that date arrives. We can't really speculate exactly what types of triggers will affect different veterans because of, again, their individual experience of symptoms. So it is very important to go to the best source available for this information, which is the veteran himself or herself, and to capture that, and also to plan in these measures on what if I feel this way. And that's like the plan, the what if plan for court that I showed you earlier. This builds on that. It's a bit more probing, however, and it's tailored to trigger responses that are unique to the individual, not just the fear of relapsing to alcohol or substances. So I want to give you that as an example of something that can certainly be implemented or even improved upon. But knowing is certainly so much of this battle. And again, notebooks, especially for individuals with traumatic brain injury or who have problems maintaining concentration. And it could also be in relation to the medications they're using that causes problems with concentration, which would make it very helpful to give them something that gives them a sense that they are able to organize their thoughts and track their improvement. So vital. All right, ways to help before the docket include relaxation exercises. One example could be just having CD players with guided relaxation that's particularly effective, and just distributing it, right? In fact, cell phones have applications now. You've got Calm is one of them, Virtual Hope Box. The Department of Veterans Affairs also has created, in conjunction with others, specific mindfulness, stress reduction, relaxation programs. And certainly these can help to set the right tone for the most effective participation. There are also audio-visual stimulation systems. Some of them are effective to the point where just 10 minutes of closing one's eyes and having the colors pulsing with certain tones can get a person in a state of relaxation that might otherwise take hours to achieve through a traditional meditation. So this could be a very helpful way also. I would caution, however, if any of the participants have a history of epilepsy, certainly you don't want to put pulsing lights in their vision stream. So there would be some limitations on who could participate with these, but these are the types of things that are interventions that are known to achieve a relaxed state, which is quite important, especially considering the susceptibility of our participants to being triggered. I think this is great. I recently found this. This is happening right now. Jennifer Wright is a person who's trained in mindful yoga therapy. She right now participates in the Hamilton County, Ohio Municipal Veterans Treatment Court, and she actually leads the veterans on the docket in yoga and physical relaxation techniques prior to the docket. And in the picture there, you actually see the courtroom and all the yoga mats laid out with all of the different services flags behind them. quite an interesting view. And here's a quote in which she says, "We hold yoga therapy prior to the docket. Feedback suggests that the pre-docket practice brings calm to the individuals and reduces anxiety. I observe it and I receive the feedback that we create a visibly calmer courtroom." There's a video on YouTube that I've included a link for where she actually talks about yoga work with veterans in general. But this is specific to the Veterans Treatment Court. Now, she may not be able to travel to everyone's chambers, but certainly there are experts in yoga in local areas who may be willing or interested in doing something like this. One important point is no one is forced to do exercises, especially if they have physical conditions that limit their flexibility or concerns about physical behaviors in general. They can do different types of breathing exercises where they're not so vulnerable if those issues are present, but they do it together, and it's on an individual basis. So something that's very, may be considered a little bit far out there or unconventional, but we're dealing with clients who have unconventional concerns and specific pathways to self-defeating behavior that require an unconventional approach. Like I said before, it's a counterinsurgency in legal counseling where you're trying to protect the client from himself or herself. In this case, you're trying to divert the Veterans Treatment Court participant not only from confinement, but from their own symptoms being aggravated. So it's an interesting viewpoint, and certainly I hope one that you'll consider. Finally, on the issue of helping the helper and secondary traumatic stress, we again want to recognize the potential for secondary traumatic stress to influence treatment team members and also the mentors. We want to take stock of the effects of secondary traumatic stress in our own lives, and we want to do it on a periodic basis, because we're not going to be able, unless we do it deliberately, to recognize subtle changes in our own belief systems and symptoms that we may be having, unless we actually stop maybe once a month and compare different aspects of our own behavior. So it's something that has to be very deliberate. And then in the workplace, we want to make sure that we normalize behavior to mitigate secondary traumatic stress, and we want to create various options in the workplace to address events as soon as possible and to process them in a way where they don't get pushed below the surface, where they can influence us at a level that we're not aware of, and that's quite frankly where the most risk lies. So I want to return to that spectrum, that continuum of interventions to assist anyone involved in litigation and exposure to secondary traumatic stress. Our least intensive measures involve just becoming aware of it for ourselves and conducting these systematic reviews of our own behavior. Our most intensive procedures involve actually bringing in a mental health professional just to help us process the information. And a lot of times there's a stigma for involving mental health professionals, especially because it suggests that we can't handle things on our own. And the answer is that this is not, it's not having a psychological problem. It's the need to address exposure to something that inevitably will affect us. So this normalization of the process and encouraging it and creating time for it, training others in the court system to help facilitate it, all of these factors are helpful because this should not be seen as being defective in any way as a professional. Out of all the tools, and I'm going to tell you in a minute about the article that I'm making available to you, but out of all the tools, I think one of the most comprehensive ones is the Professional Quality of Life scale developed by Professor Stam. And this is available to anyone to use. It's self-administered, and it's for any kind of professional. It does not only apply to mental health clinicians. It could apply to lawyers. It could apply to anyone who's exposed to traumatic material during the course of their own profession and performing duties in their profession. I've provided this to the program to distribute to you, and it's encouraged to distribute it as long as Professor Stam gets appropriate recognition for her wonderful resource. This is one of the tests in it, very simple. This piece of the test talks about compassion satisfaction and compassion fatigue. And one of the really important factors about this scale and the whole pro-qual approach is that they also look at ways, positive factors about dealing with exposure to stress. So it's not only looking at the negative, and it's a really good inventory to look at one's whole professional and personal existence in relation to this issue. In the article that I wrote for this symposium, I was focusing a bit on exposure to sexual trauma and how prosecutors and defense attorneys really need to address that exposure because of its risks. But one of the reasons why I want to make this available to you is because I was able to get permission from various mental health providers to reproduce the scales they created to make them available for use by the legal profession. So normally it's very hard to find this material. It's in books. There are permissions required to get it. It's just made very difficult to obtain these self-analysis tools. And these professionals were kind enough to allow me to reproduce them and give me permission to do that, and I want to make them available to you. One of the ideas here, especially when it comes to the self-analysis tests, is that really we're all different people, and we are wired in different ways, and some things work better on individuals than others. So you're encouraged to try to look through the different examples to find something that is appealing to you. And really, you are the expert on yourself, so it shouldn't matter as long as you're able to meet the goals, which are to identify how you're being influenced. So there's a degree of freedom there. I had earlier mentioned, when the question was asked, where could we go to get some of the specialized expertise? I mentioned, why not mental health or behavioral health division of the Department of Veterans Affairs, the medical center that you normally deal with regarding your veterans docket. And the reason I suggest that is because I think to programs like crisis intervention training, and the idea of having specially trained law enforcement officers who understand more about symptoms of mental health conditions and how to better engage persons in crisis in the community. That's an idea that emerged decades ago and has really been taking hold throughout the country. So you have crisis intervention training for correctional officers now, law enforcement officers, and others. One really important aspect of that is the veterans component. I think we forget about the fact that part of that training, and it has been since the first idea of the program came about, I believe in Memphis, Tennessee, if I'm not mistaken. But the whole idea was in training law enforcement officers to understand aspects of mental health conditions, they need to understand specific aspects involving veterans. And it was shortly after Vietnam, right around the time of the national survey on post-Vietnam readjustment, that these programs became developed. And so the idea is there's always been a VA component where VA mental health professionals have trained these law enforcement officers, introduced them to veterans' experiences and some special considerations. Oftentimes they invite veterans who are in treatment to talk about their own lived experiences, to give the law enforcement officers a personal understanding. And it's important, not all of these law enforcement officers are veterans themselves, but the VA is involved because this certainly is a way to have the most impact on a veteran in crisis where the need is at its highest level or a very high level. And that's why I would suggest there's not much difference if we're asking, we have a special docket created to assist veterans, and there will be exposure to traumatic material probably expected during the course of that process. How can we, as a treatment team members, be prepared to deal with those special veteran-specific issues? Why would this be of interest to the Department of Veterans Affairs? Probably because the whole goal is to be more effective in assisting those veterans who are in the criminal justice system. And I can see a very clear, a comparison with those. And one of the things I've realized just from working with the Department of Veterans Affairs and various partnerships is that, they're probably not going to come to you and offer this, but if you ask, you might be surprised at what they're able to do, because there is a tremendous wealth of knowledge that they have to share and that they're willing to share. And certainly the VA is, the researchers there are highly qualified to address issues related to combat trauma, as opposed to other researchers. So I would recommend reaching out and seeing it. Can they help train us to facilitate dialogues to address traumatic events, and just how do we share our concerns in a constructive way where no one feels forced to do it? How do we respond to that? And can we even maybe get help from a mental health professional to facilitate some of these discussions in recognition that, this is not a damage to anyone, but just something that's necessary to deal with in trauma work. Finally, in our last 5 minutes, I want to talk a bit about domestic violence cases in veterans treatment courts. I think it's really important to realize, and we talked about how highly controversial this area is, and concern for the experience of victims, concern for the dynamics of interpersonal violence, which is often rooted in control and manipulation and dominance. But in this context, there is a way to distinguish symptoms related to combat and operational stress, as opposed to the campaign of control. And that is probably one of the most important considerations in deciding whether to take cases, and also justifying why to take them. In addition, clearly, I don't think any VTC is unaware of the importance of seeking victim input, especially in decisions on whether to take cases if we're in a court that does take cases involving violent offenses. But something I also want to talk about, which may be a bit unconventional, is the idea of providing mentors for the veteran's domestic partner or the victim if you do take on one of these cases. And I'll talk about the reason why and what that might look like. But I think that's a balance to help really recognize the unique issues surrounding domestic and interpersonal violence. So I take you back to this common image here of returning veterans who come back from combat, who are afraid of what they might do to their spouses, who perceive threats, even if they're in protected areas, because it's just what they're so used to, and sometimes almost instinctual. I really recommend this book, Back from the Front: Combat Trauma, Loving the Family, by Aphrodite Matsakis. She is a clinician who has worked with veterans since post-Vietnam through the more recent wars. She also wrote the book Vietnam Wives, which was a fascinating account of experiences of spouses with returning combat veterans from Vietnam. So she has identified a non-combat related battering from combat related battering, and emphasizes that oftentimes there are hallmarks that help us, whether it's hallmarks or we want to call it flags or some kind of indicators to show us that this may not be related to traditional interpersonal violence. So one of the first factors is that violence is infrequent. It's usually followed by prolonged periods of guilt, self-blame, and withdrawal from the partner. Violence is usually restricted to physical and emotional abuse and rarely involves economic, social, and other forms of abuse. Violence typically occurs during certain flashbacks to combat-related experiences in times of family loss or injury, or when the vet is feeling powerless over his emotions, his finances, his personal relationships, or some other aspect of his life. These are hallmarks of combat-related battering, as opposed to the non-combat related batterer, where you have a person who usually takes no responsibility for his actions and blames the victim for provoking them. So that's kind of very interesting as a comparison point. In addition, I edited an article in the Family Court Review by Glenna Tinney and April Gerlach, who are very experienced in domestic violence issues, especially on active duty military installations. In distinguishing between PTSD symptoms and interpersonal violence tactics, you see on the left certain symptoms that may be related to a veteran's behavior with a spouse or domestic partner. On the other hand, you have that contrasted with interpersonal violence tactics. The point of this comparison is that when you're not carefully looking for these indicators, you can easily mistake something for interpersonal violence tactics when in fact it relates to combat symptoms. I would encourage you to look at that because it's important in showing that it's a different dynamic. Certainly, programs tailored for domestic violence that is perpetrated out of the dominance and control model may not really be the most effective thing to help address the issues related to PTSD and operational stress injury symptoms. It may very well be that if you can identify those types of combat-related behaviors, a treatment approach in a veterans treatment court could be far more effective, and that's why it could be helpful. But now I want to share with you a comment from Judge Janice Rosa. I had a chance to work with her on an article she wrote in the Family Court Review as well. She implemented a family court docket for military members and their families in Buffalo, New York, of all places, right? And she had that military family initiative going, and she addressed her concern about how it's different when you have a veteran and a spouse. And let's remember that the spouses of veterans have gone through very important cultural military events that kind of give them, a very heightened need to have those issues addressed also with some degree of consideration, and certainly where a mentor could be helpful who's experienced the same things. So she says the search for a ready source of mentors for divorcing spouses of military is uncharted, but vital territory to explore. The criminal VTC model relies on the support of the mentor volunteer to maintain the focus of the litigant and draw on his or her strengths to preserve and successfully complete the terms of a criminal case. The author hypothesizes that a similar effect would occur in family civil cases if both litigants in a divorce or custody case would have a separate mentor assigned, an unrelated neutral coach to provide the stabilizing force of age and maturity to the marital or family dispute. My recommendation, especially to avoid the highly controversial issues, is to explore this option. And certainly if you're near a military installation where there are family readiness programs and other programs for military family members, I believe there would be a ready source of interested mentors who would be willing and interested in helping the other person involved in a domestic violence or IPV case. So with that, I hope that we've explored more of the concerns at a practical level to build off of our earlier examination, and would love to hear any questions you might have.
Just a reminder, if anyone does have questions, you should go to the participants panel at the bottom right of your screen, the Q&A section, and you can go ahead and type any questions or comments in there.
I'd be interested to know if anyone is exploring stress reduction techniques before their docket, who might be in the audience and willing to share some thoughts on that.
Hi, Evan. It looks like we did receive a question, a couple of questions.
Good.
So first, Rick Reed would like to know what is being done from the Department of Defense side to lower the rate of violence in those vets affected by PTSD.
Well, the military is extremely interested in this area. There are various programs to try to gain some sort of handle on this issue. Certainly, the statistics demonstrate an increase in both neglect of children and harm to children in this context, especially during the course of deployments by the non-deployed spouses. That's an interesting development as well. But one of the case review committees, I really think they're vital in this whole process, because they try to do individualized plans to address situations they become aware of. And that's highly scrutinized. Again, there are a number of factors that contribute to this. And, again, there's another piece of the willingness of a spouse or a victim to come forward if that's going to have a financial impact or hardship or end the career potentially of the spouse who's the breadwinner. So these factors make it difficult to prevent all cases, but certainly there's emphasis also on leadership from the unit representatives to have a handle on this and to try to spot any kind of behavior that would indicate that someone's having issues that they don't see when they go back home. So different types of surveillance and trying to intervene as early as possible. It's really hard to, in general terms, to say what exactly will be required for a solution, but there's definitely an effort being made to identify one.
Great, thank you, Evan. We also have some comments from Janine, who has been working in Kenya and has commented that they've seen incredible increases in family violence from their military who are fighting terrorists. Not really questions, comments, and she was more interested in domestic violence and how that plays out with veterans.
I didn't get all of the question, but it's interesting. I was at a presentation by one of the UN representatives who goes out into, especially in Africa, to see what's happening on the ground. And she talks about the fact that sexual assault is actually being used as a technique on civilians to clear areas, to get people to leave. It's actually part of a military strategy, or at least a strategy of an armed group of people to gain a military advantage. So I'm interested to hear the rest of that question, but I'm glad you raised that point. Please.
Evan, it was less of a question, more of a comment. Just kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on that issue. And we have another question, though, about domestic violence-related events with PTSD and vets. And the question is there any training to certify local providers that can address veteran needs versus civilian needs?
Well, one of the things that Ms. Tinney and Ms. Gerlach talk about in their article, and I would encourage you to take a look at that. They are involved in that, and there's actually I would refer you to a gentleman named Brian Clubb, and you may remember him from his work at the NADCP Justice for Vets program. He is working with an organization that deals with IPV issues, and he's the military liaison for that. So I'm going to provide his information, but I think he's probably one of the best resources to ask that question about how to get that certification and training. So I want to make sure that you get the information on how to contact him because it ties into that distinction. The point they make in their article is that family court judges need to pick the right people to look into these issues because it's easy not to make these distinctions, and that can really be a concern. So certainly we want as many trained professionals who are qualified to do this to be able to lend their expertise in this area.
Great, thank you. And we don't have any other questions from the attendees. I actually do have a question. I was wondering, do you know anything about as far as trauma, body trauma and body memory and that component of it? A lot of PTSD looks at the mental, psychological aspects, but I'm curious if you've thought about how it gets transferred to the body.
Yeah, I had a great opportunity. I hope I'm saying his name right. It's Vanderkolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score. A fascinating psychiatrist who's worked with veterans for such a long time and has an institute where he deals with traumatized veterans. The book really emphasizes how, in many cases, so much more can be accomplished when you bring in a physical component, especially like yoga. He talked a bit about, actually showed that there could be people who are just not responsive to anything and in almost a catatonic state because of traumatic experiences. But the way to get through to them is to throw them a beach ball and just have them moving, and then they open up in a way that they aren't able to do in other ways. And he's perfected that more than anyone I know. And his book out there, The Body Keeps the Score, I think is the title, really goes into the scientific proof that this physical component is essential to address if you want to do a more comprehensive treatment of a traumatic experience.
Well, thank you, Evan. I think that our time is just about up, and we very much appreciate all of your insights and information, and we will be sending out the materials and the PowerPoints, and then look forward to the next webinar, which is, Monica, when is the next one that's scheduled?
Carolyn, we have our next webinar related to Veterans Treatment Courts is going to be on the role of the mentor, which is going to be on Wednesday, March 2nd. And our next session with Major Simone is not until Tuesday, March 22nd, where we'll be discussing the topic of discharge upgrades. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you. I guess Kerwin didn't get a chance to answer any questions on this one, but he's our point person, Kerwin Henderson, for any questions people have on Veterans Treatment Courts generally. And in between now and the next session, we are working with a number of Veterans Treatment Courts in the various states. So feel free, if you have any questions about your program, to follow up with us. So thank you, everybody, and have a nice weekend. Okay, bye.